shifts in the second half of this book to medicine and science, and you start to find these people who are hybrids. They call themselves philosopher physicians, or they're physicians who also take up the role of the philosopher. They say, in fact, philosophers have no role in this. They shouldn't even get a vote in this. We're the only people who know this because it's part of the body. So the discourse really does move to these emerging fields, very unstable emerging fields: mental medicine, moral medicine, psychiatry, alienism, human science. All of these fields emerge to try to encompass the mind as a science.
What do you think are the key open questions in the neurosciences or thinking about the mind?
You know, I think the key open questions is the key open question that you would have found in 1650. I think that right now we don't have a model that merges neural networks with mind, with the capacity for free will, with the capacity for intention, motivation, top-down regulation, by which I mean like ideas make me do things. I came here quickly, early, in a subway, because I wanted to be here, not because of something else. So the idea that I had to do something was critical to my coming here. Now, there are arguments that people will make with that, but I think that is a huge amount of unanswered questions for us.
What about the mind-body connection? Because there's kind of a brain in the gut, there's a brain in the spinal column as well. We have very little time, but I was wondering, does that solve some of that mind-body separate thinking?
Only makes it more mysterious.
George McCary will be hosting a discussion at the New School Center Forensic Center at 63 Fifth Avenue on December 16th at 8 p.m. For more information about that, visit our show page at wnyc.org/Lopate. His book, Soul Machine, The Invention of the Modern Mind, is published by Norton. And I thank you so much for being on our show today. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks so much.
On tomorrow's show, former New York Times columnist David Pogue gives tips and shortcuts on everything from getting the last bit of ketchup out of the bottle to cooling a spicy mouth. And then we'll learn about Frank Morgan, the great jazz alto saxophonist who did most of his playing in bands at San Quentin State Prison. Plus, New York Film Festival director Kent Jones talks about the legacy of Alfred Hitchcock. And we will hear about the lives of 3 Syrian women who were all former members of ISIS's morality police and then managed to escape. The Leonard Lopate Show is produced by Andres Sahara-Plotnik, Jessica Miller, and Jenna Cater. Melissa Higgins, the executive producer. Dave Emmert was at the audio controls. We had help today from Caitlin Shawalia and contributing producers Fran Jacobs and Hugh Sansom. I'm Leonard Lopate, your host. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.
WNYC support comes from the New Jersey Performing Arts Center, presenting astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson on December 2nd at 8 p.m. as he separates science fiction from fact in popular films. Tickets for Neil deGrasse Tyson at njpac.org.
There was something that was different.
I'm Mary Harris. This week on Only Human, when Rose was young, she realized there was something strange about the way she heard the world.
I knew I was happy, and I knew I was strong and smart and all these things, but in certain situations I couldn't keep up.
The mystery of Rose's childhood and what it has to do with how all of us hear the world. Listen at onlyhuman.org or on the WNYC app.
Today on The Takeaway, a look back at the life and work of New York Times reporter Jeff Schmalz, whose AIDS diagnosis revolutionized both the way newsrooms cover the epidemic and how they handle the disease internally. That's today at 3 on 93.9 FM. Meanwhile, you can catch up with the day's news on Here and Now on AM 820, and that's what's coming up next.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM, New York. Just keep listening. From WHYY in Philadelphia, I'm Terry Gross with Fresh Air. Psycho, Vertigo, The Birds, and Notorious are some of the Alfred Hitchcock films discussed in the new documentary Hitchcock Truffaut, which was inspired by the interviews Francois Truffaut recorded with Hitchcock in 1962. Today, the documentary's director, Kent Jones, talks about Hitchcock's filmmaking, including the famous shower scene from Psycho.
In order to time the shots perfectly so that he's not showing her breasts, he had to shoot in slow motion so that he could control the visual information.
And Niecy Nash talks about co-starring as a nurse on the HBO series Getting On, which is set in the extended care wing of a hospital.
He removed her gallbladder.
Okay.
Then she had a stroke. Then an IV fell over and hit her on top of the head. And
Oh, well.
here we all are.
First News. From NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. Calling the erosion of public trust in Chicago police an undeniable fact, Mayor Rahm Emanuel is ordering a shakeup in law enforcement. He's responding to the recent arrest of an officer who was charged with the first-degree murder of a black teenager 13 months ago, a case that has fueled national anger over police treatment of African-American men. Today, Police Superintendent Jerry McCarthy stepped down. Chicago is also creating a new task force on accountability. Mayor Rahm Emanuel says those are among many steps needed to repair damaged relations.
From body cameras to today's task force to the new superintendent. This is not the end of the problem, but it is the beginning of the solution to the problem.
Anger of the death of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald rose after the city released dashcam video apparently showing the officer firing multiple times at the teen as he was walking away. Now the family of another man fatally shot by Chicago police last year is pressing for the release of squad car video of the shooting of their relative. Mayor Emanuel says the city is looking into it. Leaders of poor nations most affected by climate change shared stories of their plight with the heads of richer countries today at the Global Climate Conference. In Paris, NPR's Eleanor Beardsley reports this is the first time developing nations are being asked to contribute to reduce global emissions and slow the warming of the climate.
President Obama met with heads of Pacific Island nations at risk of disappearing in rising waters. Britain's Prince Charles sat down with indigenous leaders to call attention to shrinking global forests from South America to Africa, in part caused by illegal logging. And French President François Hollande heard from 12 African leaders who described the Sahara Desert encroaching on farmland. Hollande said France would invest billions of euros in the coming years for renewable energy in Africa and to increase Africans' access to electricity. He said the developed world owes the African continent an environmental debt. Eleanor Beardsley, NPR News at the Global Climate Summit in Paris.
Sunny Spain was a leader in renewable energy in Europe until the economic crisis hit. Lauren Fair reports from Madrid, where Spain's biggest renewable energy company is now teetering on the brink of bankruptcy.
Abengoa was Spain's biggest renewable energy company with huge solar plants all over Spain and abroad. The company has received more than $3 billion in loans from the U.S. government for solar plants like one in Arizona that's the largest of its type in the world. Now Abengoa could be Spain's biggest ever bankruptcy. The Spanish government slashed subsidies for solar and wind power 2 years ago, crippling the whole renewables industry here. Last week, Abengoa failed to close a deal with a new investor. Its CEO has resigned. Stock has plunged more than 50%. Investors could lose some $30 billion. For NPR News, I'm Lauren Fryer in Madrid.
This is NPR. The Cuban government is reinstating controversial restrictions on doctors who want to leave the country for personal travel. 2 years after easing immigration law, the government is again imposing a mandate that medical providers seek special permission to leave the island. The Cuban government argues it is forced to do so because the flight of medical specialists, it says, has seriously affected the country's free healthcare system. Cuba, which has recently restored full diplomatic ties with the United States, blames U.S. policy for the flight. Construction spending has risen to its highest level in 8 years in the U.S. The Commerce Department says the October increase was driven by residential and government spending. More from NPR's Yuki Noguchi.
Construction spending has gained steam all year and was up 1% in October, posting a bigger gain than expected. The expenditures topped $1.1 trillion on a seasonally adjusted annual basis. That's 13% higher than the same period last year, and the highest level since before the Great Recession. Spending on building of schools, highways, and private homes all increased during the month. Construction spending is one of the brighter spots in the economy. Despite a stronger job market, consumers are holding back on spending and the manufacturing sector is contracting.
Yuki Noguchi, NPR News, Washington. Puerto Rico has until midnight to make a $355 million bond payment. However, it's uncertain if the U.S. Commonwealth will be able to manage it. The island is confronted with a growing economic crisis. It's attempting to restructure deals on its $72 billion in public debt. I'm Lakshmi Singh, NPR News, Washington.
Support for NPR comes from the Pajamagram Company, offering matching holiday pajamas for the entire family, even the cats and dogs. Over 27 family sets online in knits, fleece, and flannel at pajamagram.com. And from the National Endowment for the Arts, Art Works.
I'm Anna Sale, host of Death, Sex, and Money. Actress Holland Taylor earned a Tony nomination for her one-woman show about the former governor of Texas, Ann Richards. And when it was over,
I really kind of went blank. I'd almost qualify it as a breakdown.
But that breakdown opened her up to a new kind of relationship at 72 years old.
I am understood by the person who loves me before I'm understood by myself.
Hear our conversation at deathsexmoney.org.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross.
Good evening. I'm Alfred Hitchcock, and tonight I'm presenting the first in a series of stories of suspense and mystery called, oddly enough, Alfred Hitchcock Presents. I shall not act in these stories, but will only make appearances, something in the nature of an accessory before and after the fact, to give the title to those of you who can't read, and to tidy up afterwards for those who don't understand the endings.
Hosting his own TV series starting in 1955 helped make Alfred Hitchcock a household name and a familiar face. Many of his films are now considered classics, like Shadow of a Doubt, Notorious, North by Northwest, The Birds, Rear Window, Vertigo, and Psycho. Here's Anthony Perkins in Psycho as Norman Bates, after he's been talking about his invalid, emotionally abusive, controlling mother. Janet Leigh's character, not realizing how mentally unhinged Norman Bates is, suggests that he put his mother someplace.
You mean an institution? A madhouse? People always call a madhouse someplace, don't they? Put her in someplace.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean it to sound uncaring.
What do you know about caring? Have you ever seen the inside of one of those places? The laughing and the tears, and the cruel eyes studying you. My mother there. But she's harmless. She's as harmless as one of those stuffed birds.
I am sorry. I only felt... It seems she's hurting you. I meant well.
People always mean well. They cluck their thick tongues and shake their heads and suggest oh so very delicately. Of course, I've suggested it myself. But I hate to even think about it. She needs me. It's not as if she were a maniac, a raving thing. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes. Haven't you?
Although Hitchcock is now acknowledged as one of the greatest directors of the 20th century, he wasn't seen that way during much of his career. He just was considered a great entertainer, the master of suspense. In 1962, the young French filmmaker and critic Francois Truffaut, whose films The 400 Blows and Jules and Jim had already made him a leading figure of the new wave of French cinema, wanted to convince Americans of Hitchcock's genius. So he flew to Hollywood, where he spent a week interviewing Hitchcock with a translator. Truffaut adapted the interviews into the 1966 book Hitchcock Truffaut. That book, which analyzed each of Hitchcock's films, often frame by frame, became a touchstone for many young directors. Now film critic Kent Jones, who directs the New York Film Festival, has directed and co-written a new film called Hitchcock Truffaut. This documentary features audio excerpts of the Hitchcock Truffaut interviews, clips from Hitchcock and Truffaut films, behind-the-scenes footage, as well as new commentary from current directors, including Martin Scorsese, Wes Anderson, Richard Linklater, and David Fincher. Kent Jones, welcome to Fresh Air. Why did Truffaut want to do a week-long series of interviews with Alfred Hitchcock?
Well, he wanted to prove to the world how important Alfred Hitchcock was, and that's because when he came to New York to do press for Jules and Jim in 1962, he was bombarded with questions from American journalists and critics who were asking him, what filmmakers influenced you? He would invariably list, Jean Renoir, different people like that, and then he would say Alfred Hitchcock, and they would say, you're kidding. The other issue was that he wanted to kind of look at Hitchcock within the context of Hollywood, where he was making films rather than removing him and putting him on some kind of an abstract, Homeric plane, which is what was happening in French criticism.
And when Truffaut wrote the letter to Hitchcock proposing this series of interviews, Hitchcock responded with a letter in which he said, your letter brought tears to my eyes. It's very moving. That it was so important to him that a French director, a young French director, was going to take his movies that seriously.
There's an emotional relationship and exchange between these two men that's extremely moving. They were very different in a lot of ways, in other ways similar. They were both very shy in certain ways, in other ways not at all. And they both had a deep and abiding love for cinema, but they came at it through different generations, extremely different circumstances. Really, what it is Hitchcock asking the question, was I good enough? Was I an artist to be taken seriously? And Truffaut answering consistently throughout the exchange, yes. Not only were you good enough, you were foundational.